grey Sunday morning in late summer, and the entrance to Weymouth Harbour is graced by a flight of falcons beating their way into the bay for a romping sail in the freshening wind. The wooden falcons have been a part of the Weymouth scenery for the past 69 years. Unlike their feathered namesakes, they are an endangered species. They have not regenerated for 25 years, and there is no prospect of this happening in the future. One owner described her boat to me as a piece of old furniture requiring the same loving care. And here is the truth of the matter. Their owners are a small band of enthusiasts who are prepared to spend long hours scraping and varnishing and doing the 101 tasks necessary to enjoy those few short months each year sailing on the bay. This film is dedicated to them. The Weymouth Falcon is a one-design, 16-foot wooden clinker-built sailing dinghy which has been in existence since 1927. This Bermudan rigged classic cost £42 10 shillings at that time, which included one set of sails, an anchor and cable, and topping lift and claw. When the boats were purchased, their owners were permitted to embellish their boat sails with their own insignias. There were, however, certain rules applicable to the class when racing. The Falcons could not carry ballast. Under normal conditions they could not race single-handed, nor must the crew exceed 3 in number. Spinnakers were out, and the dinghies had to have buoyancy tanks of at least 12 gallons capacity. It was obligatory to carry an anchor and 15 feet of approved rope. The original concept was to provide club members with a boat which would fulfill their racing needs and be robust enough for ordinary cruising. Here we see members of Weymouth Sailing Club rigging their boats for an evening's racing. Weymouth has, in my view, one of the most attractive and accessible harbours along England's south coast. It is a mecca for small boat enthusiasts and is truly the home of the Falcons. Local sailing history is embroidered with tales of these old dinghies and their owners. Many club members have served their sailing apprenticeships in these sea-kindly reminders of a bygone age. The history of the Falcons is far too involved for me to do any more than merely scratch at its surface. Weymouth Sailing Club as it is today, and much has changed since when in 1926 the committee of that year decided to back the building of a one-design sailing dinghy. Local boat builder, club member and the club's landlord, Mr. Bussell, was consulted, and 3 weeks later produced a set of blueprints. The Weymouth Falcon was conceived. These old photographs, although I must stress not of that period, show the location where the first Falcons were built. It appears that Mr. Bussell was a man of perception, because he commenced constructing the prototype Sparrowhawk upon completion of the blueprints. Orders were eventually placed, and Mr. Bussell undertook to produce 5 boats by the beginning of May 1927. And so in May 1927, as promised, the first 5 Falcons were launched. These were heady days for the club. The Falcons achieved instant success. In 1928, Weymouth Sailing Club hosted the Oxford vs Cambridge Inter-University Sailing Match and the Cambridge University Cruising Club's Marine Week. Both events were sailed in Falcons loaned by club members. In 1847, the original breakwater to the impressive Portland Harbour was built by convicts from Portland Prison who were awaiting deportation to Australia. The Royal Navy has until recently had links with Portland since the Crimean War. In the 1890s, facilities to make and test torpedoes were established here. In 1928, this was the scene of high drama concerning the Falcon Merlin. At the far side of Portland Harbour, where the Portland Road joins the Chesil Bank, is Ferry Bridge. In 1928, on the presently defunct Wellworthy site, stood the premises of the Whitehead Torpedo Company. On that ill-fated June day, a Mr. Bratby and his daughter Frida, who was at the helm, were out sailing in Merlin when the boat was struck by a runaway torpedo. The torpedo lifted Merlin out of the water and stove in 2 planks near the waterline. Both were rescued, but Mr. Bratby, already forbidden to race by his doctor, never sailed again. At that time, Whiteheads used to convey torpedoes from their works along rails beneath the then existing railway line to a jetty, which has since been demolished. The torpedoes were then tested from this jetty into Portland Harbour. This is a plated replica of the huge solid silver trophy eventually presented to the club by Whiteheads to be competed for annually by the Falcons. These photographs show Weymouth Harbour when the Falcons were in their heyday. The intervening years have had their fair share of good times and bad times. Years when the Falcons saw a world war from which 4 of their owners sadly never returned. Years of such change that it is difficult to imagine how it used to be. Some will say change for the better, some will disagree. Whatever one's thoughts, however, time goes inevitably onwards. Keen eyes will spot the many changes which have taken place over the years. The modern catamaran to the Channel Islands, the pavilion replacing the Ritz which burnt down, the up-to-date lifeboat and a harbour generally in commercial decline but expanding in leisure activities. Although their numbers have depleted, the clinker falcons are still to be seen sailing in Weymouth Bay. As I said earlier, the life of the youngest falcon now spans a quarter of a century, so clearly regular maintenance is essential. Here we see Peter Jacobs, the current club falcon captain, with his son, doing some running repairs.
Alright, we're 10 seconds to go.
Okay.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Racing within the club is as keenly contested as ever. Plastic has replaced wood to a large degree, and the falcons look misplaced in time as they make their way to the starting line. They have a certain uniqueness, an individuality, an identity each of their own, which is difficult to find in their successors. Each carries the signatures of the craftsman responsible for its construction. We can still find the firm of W.L. Bussell tucked away in Hope Street, where it has always been. The premises have now been modernised by the present owner, Mike Bygrave, who received a civic award for his efforts. Mike built the last Falcons, and I asked him for his recollections of that time.
It would have been about in the early 60s when I applied for a job down here as the foreman, and from the early 60s to about 69 there was quite a number of the Falcons built, and I always thought they were lovely boats, but when I had a chance to take the firm over in 1969, I thought it was about time they were modernised. So one of the first things I did when I took the firm over was to approach Weymouth Sailing Club, and namely the captain of the Falcon fleet in those days, and ask him permission to modify them. The modifications were quite a step forward for the Falcon that hadn't really been modified since the day the first type, the Weymouth one, was first built. We decided that it would be better if we made the gunnels into box gunnels, which meant that the ribs came up through the hull right up to the top, and the gunnel was planted on the inside, and then with the rubbing strake outside, which made a much bigger sort of a girder stiffening right round the hull, which stopped the boat working so much. Number two, we had hanging knees off of the midship thwart, the midship seat down to the box, and also big hanging knees down over the hull. There were one or two other modifications, but that was the main ones that we carried out, and it seemed to be very successful because the boats were much more rigid and seemed to sail better. All the Falcons were actually built in this building. Where we're sat now used to be the old sawmill downstairs here, and upstairs was the dinghy loft, and where the Falcons and the other dinghies were all built, and they were lowered out through the big doors at the back on blocks and tackles into the open boat yard, the other side of the lane here, as it used to be. The last Falcon was built in about 1971. The orders just seemed to dry up because the young sailors coming on seemed to fancy a much faster boat, and with the advent of the squib coming into the club, of course, people liked the squib. It was much faster. Maintenance, of course, was easier, and the squib seemed to take over. But there always was, of course, and still is, a hardcore of people which do love Falcons and wouldn't dream of sailing anything else.
Most of the construction of the last Falcon in 1971 was filmed by local filmmaker Paddy Coulter, seen here in his shop in Park Street. You are about to see a copy of that same film, which is quite unique. We first see the keel being made. Then the stem and the transom post were attached to it, forming the backbone of the boat. This assembly was made from kerowing, which is better known as Malayan hardwood. Kerowing is a very resinous, rot-resistant timber. The next stage was to firmly secure the backbone through the centre plate slot to the dinghy loft floor. Each Falcon's number was carved in Roman numerals on the stem. Jigs were put into position, and these were attached to the dinghy loft roof. The transom was then made from solid mahogany. Upon completion, the transom was fitted to the transom post and was also attached to the roof. It was necessary to steam the timbers to make them pliable enough to be manipulated into the complex angles required to construct the boat. The steamers were essentially do-it-yourself jobs. Mike used a water tank heated by two 3 kilowatt heaters. There was a pipe connecting this to a length of 12-inch sewerage pipe, which contained a length of timber that prevented the boat timbers lying in water as they were being steamed. It could be a long process. For example, the kerowing used for the keel was steamed for almost a day before it could be worked upon. African mahogany was used for the planking, and each plank had to be individually cut to size, as each differed in shape to its neighbour. The only softwood used on the boat was for the Falcon's mast and spars. I found it amusing when I discovered that these originated as wooden scaffolding poles cut from Weymouth forest. Each plank was rebaited or chased to permit smooth fixing at the stem and transom. The planks were held together for fixing with special clamps known to boat builders as nippers or gripes. Here we see holes being drilled for the plank fixings. To secure the planks, square sectioned pure copper nails were hammered home. Where the planks were fastened to each other, they were riveted together by pushing pure copper nails through pre-drilled holes from the outside and placing copper rows over the nails inside before cutting off the nails and riveting over the ends, whilst holding a metal dolly on the heads of the nails. You will see this procedure later. The planking completed, the hull is then held secure by timbers wedged against the outside. The hull secure, we now see a youthful Mike Bygrave removing the jigs to enable the inside of the Falcon to be completed. Lengths of Canadian rock elm, having been steamed in the steamer, were then bent to the shape of the inside of the hull to form the boat's ribs. When shaped and fitted in the correct place, the ribs were then fastened to the hull using the now familiar copper nails. In clouds of steam, hot Canadian rock elm gunnels and rubbing strakes were dragged from the steamer and swiftly bent to shape. They were then clamped into position on the top of the boat before finally being fixed into place. The method of riveting using copper nails and rows I described earlier is illustrated here. The centre plate case was constructed from mahogany, and before being fitted to the hull, sealing compound and caulking cotton were applied to the joint to prevent the ingress of water at this point. This case had to be substantially made to accommodate the centre plate, which was moulded from cast iron and weighed somewhere around 100 weight. Incidentally, the centre plate was cast by a Bridport firm, which has now closed down. The hull had suddenly been transformed. The mahogany thwarts were fitted and a pile of timber was evolving through the craftsman's skilled hands into a fine seaworthy sailing machine. Long copper nails were driven into the gunwales. Later, rubbing strakes would be fitted, sandwiching the hull planking and the ribs between them and the gunwales, forming box gunwales. Ribs were sawn flush with the gunwales, and massive hanging knees were fitted to the centre thwart. Quarter knees were fitted between the transom and the side of the boat. Above the forward thwart, to secure it in place, there was fitted this curiously shaped piece of wood, which was known as the Admiral's hat. It was at the forward thwart that the mast would eventually be stepped, so it was shaped at the centre to accommodate this, and the fittings were then screwed in place. The final part of Paddy's footage shows the fittings for the rigging being screwed to the hull. The Falcon you have seen here was named Harrier and was given a scarlet pimpernel on her sail. The observant would have noticed the number 71 carved on her stem. "25 years later, she can still be seen at her moorings outside Weymouth Sailing Club. Here we see Roger Fox in the smock with his crew preparing for an evening's sailing. Seeing Harrier is a reminder to me of the skills of men being forgotten and largely disregarded by our present generation. Men who could get scaffolding poles from Wareham Forest and work on them for 2 or 3 days to produce a mast and boom for a boat such as this. Men who could have an empty dinghy loft and a pile of wood, and by the skill of their hands produce something which has stood the test of time for nearly 7 decades and given enormous pleasure to a large number of people. For many years the Falcons spearheaded the activities and influenced the ethos of Weymouth Sailing Club. I hope that at the end of the day there will always be a place in the club for this wonderful old boat. I think it appropriate that the final word in this small tribute to the Falcon should come from Peter Jacobs.
Well, to my knowledge, there's at least 15 Falcons still in existence around the country, of which there are 12, luckily, still in Weymouth Sailing Club. There's sort of a hardcore of 8 or 9 of those that actually sail and race regularly. It's really pleasing to be involved in this film, especially when you consider that it forms such a great part of the Weymouth Sailing Club's history, as well as Weymouth Town, because you know, it's all happened here since the 20s or late 20s. It's all happened in Weymouth, in and around Weymouth, with local characters, local people, and it really has formed quite a major part of the club's history. It's a really nice boat to sail, very forgiving, always puts you in mind of sort of Swallows and Amazons, you know, and you could actually spend hours and hours of fun just sailing around all the coves around Weymouth in comparative safety, because it is such an easy and forgiving boat to sail. It's given a lot of the club members over the years a great deal of pleasure, and I think it's only the fact of the high maintenance that actually puts people off eventually, due to the sort of modern stresses of everyday life, you know. It just takes too much time for a lot of people. But saying that, I still think that the Falcon will form quite a major part of the club's history for at least the next, well, until the millennium, because my boat's 41 years old, and okay, it's got a few little leaks in it, but if I was to spend 40 hours or so, I could probably put it right, and it would go on for another 40 years, I'm quite sure of that. And when you consider there's the last boat to be built was in 1971, then there's probably a good 30, 40 years left in the majority of the boats that are left.